Hello there, my name is Mark Bickle. I'm one of the pastors here at Grace, and we are looking at the New City Catechism, question number 7. The first 6 questions of the Catechism dealt with the purposes of life, who is God, God's creation, and God's glory. Now we turn to a section of the Catechism that's going to be dealing with questions of what God requires of man, and a series of questions that will look at the law of God, and particularly at the 10 Commandments of God. Today's question, question 7. What does the law of God require? And the answer, personal, perfect, and perpetual obedience. That we love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. What God forbids should never be done, and what God commands should always be done. Let's take a look back at that question. The question is, what does the law of God require? And before we answer that question specifically, there's probably a larger question in a lot of people's mind of what is the law of God and why does the law of God even matter to us? Before we ask what it requires and what it says, why is that even an important question? Well, take a look back again. What have we seen so far in the first couple questions? We've seen that God is the one who created everything that exists, including created me. Well, as my creator and as the King of the universe, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, well, of course, I am God's subject. He is the one who creates, I'm the created. He is the one who is the king, who sits on the throne, who rules eternal. And therefore, just as any king, God has laws, decrees, ways that he has declared his kingdom should run, ways that his people should relate to him. And as any king, he has a full right to demand that his people obey those laws, and that if they don't obey those laws, there be punishments, and that if they do obey those laws, there be blessings. And so one way of looking at the law of God is that it's the king's law for all of us who he has created to follow. Another way of looking at the law of God is as a father to his children, right? When we say to our 2-year-old child, do not run in the busy street, it's not because we've arbitrarily decided streets are bad or we don't want children in them or that we want to punish our child. No. Actually, we know how the universe works. We know what street this is. We know how many cars come and what speed they come at. And we know that for a little 2-year-old child who doesn't know any better, it would be very dangerous and they might injure or kill themselves by running into it. And so we make a rule, a law, that they should not cross the street. So another way of looking at the law of God is that God, who has created us and who loves us and is serving as a parent for us, he looks at the world, he knows how the world works, he knows what's going to be good for us, he knows what's going to be bad for us. And therefore, he sets down some rules for us who don't know any better ourselves so that we don't go do things that will be detrimental to our own selves, to our relationships with others, to our relationships with him. So the law of God, God's rules he's put forth as the King of the universe, those things that he's put forth as a loving parent to his children. So then, God has put forth these laws. What does the law of God require of us? Well, notice the first phrase here, personal, perfect, and perpetual obedience. Of course, a law is about obedience. You obey the laws. And notice, though, the interesting words that it puts here, personal. It's about personal obedience. These aren't just rules for a nation or for a group or for some other time, right? These are personal. They require obedience on my part, on each one of our parts. Perfect obedience, personal and perfect. Just as the king, if he puts forth 10 laws, you can't keep 9 of them and then go do what you want for the 10th, right? Any place where you disobey the law is serious, it's significant. So God requires perfect, total, complete obedience and perpetual obedience. These laws weren't set up for a moment in time, they're set up for good, for all of time. These laws aren't just for me to follow for a time in my life, but for me to follow for all of my life. They require perfect, personal, perpetual obedience. And then what does that look like? How would I put these together? I mean, if I look through the Bible, there's hundreds of different laws laid out in the Bible. Well, both the Old Testament and the New Testament will summarize those laws under two principles. Jesus will say at one point that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. That is the first and greatest commandment. Love God, right? A whole series of the laws reflect around how do we love God. The first of several of the 10 commandments reflect love of God and total love of God, right? Not just doing some fun actions for God, not just giving a sacrifice here and there, but all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our strength, all that we are is to love God. And then second is like it, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Those around us, our friends, our enemies, those we know, those we don't know. We're to give love to them, the kind of sacrificial love that Christ has given to us. Another way of putting what it means to follow the law is that anything God forbids should never be done, and anything God commands should always be done. If he said, don't go there, I don't ever go there. And if he says, this should always happen, then I should always be doing this. That is the requirements of the law of God. Now, an interesting question is, can you and I keep that? Well, of course, if I just look at my own heart this week, this day, have I done everything to love God at every moment, always, completely? Have I loved every person whose life I've come in contact with? No, I haven't. And that's part of the point of the law, which we'll discuss in some future weeks. Part of the point of the law is as we look at it, we realize we can't keep it. Part of what happens as we look closer at the law is we realize that both we can't keep it, and as we look at the life of Christ, that he does keep it. That he is the only one who personally, perfect, and perpetually kept the law. Who loved God with all he had and loved every neighbor as he loved himself. And therefore he becomes the one who can die in my place, who can forgive the sins that I have. But we're getting ahead of ourselves there. Today, the question is simply, what does the law of God require? And the answer to that question is personal, perfect, and perpetual obedience. That we love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our minds, and with all our strength. And that we love our neighbors as ourselves. That what God forbids should never be done, and what God commands should always be done.